We have our keynote remarks now from U.S. Ambassador to India, Eric Garcetti. He joins us from India. He's been on lots of planes to make it here. He is marking his 1-year anniversary from his time there, and we were going to take a video. You should all check out the video that he made of his 1-year anniversary. We'll send it around in the thank you so you can take a look at it. But I do also want to point out that Asia Society spotted the ambassador early. In 2006, he was one of our Asia 21 Asia Society Fellows. So if we had a screen, we would have shown you this picture of Ambassador Garcetti when he was with us in 2006. And he was keeping good company. Also in that class is a former senator from the Philippines, Malaysia's former health minister, and also the vice president of the current vice president of Taiwan. So we called Ambassador Garcetti first way back in 2006, and I see him here. Let's please welcome the ambassador to the stage.
Thank you. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be back in California. And when I knew I was going to be back in California, I didn't know I was going to be outside enjoying the California weather, but it is so great to be home. I just came from 3 days in Washington, D.C., where last year I actually missed the gathering of all the ambassadors of the world. It's nicknamed Ambassador Prom, but it's the time that 200 ambassadors representing the United States in every country come together. Can you hear it? Maybe I'll put it up a little higher. Is it off?
No, it's not.
Hi, I'm Eric Garcetti. I was just saying it was great to be back in California, first of all. I just came from Washington, D.C. for our annual Ambassadors Conference, where all the ambassadors that represent the United States and all the nations of the world come together once a year at the State Department, just to talk about the state of the world, to compare notes, an extraordinary moment to meet with our own leadership, as well as to compare with each other. As the Secretary of State said, maybe not the most dangerous time we've ever lived in, but certainly the most complex. Not just a war in Ukraine, not only the war in Israel and Gaza, but also the wars that make no headlines, like the greatest humanitarian threat on the face of the earth right now in Sudan, the unrest in Congo. Put on top of that the technological change that we face, certainly here in Silicon Valley, the final aha moment of AI, whether you call it artificial or, as I prefer, augmented intelligence. The way that we're looking at an economy that is unsure, politics that seem to be all about throwing people out or at least sending messages, an impatient electorate everywhere in the world. These are things that have made the pace of change so complicated. And certainly for those of us who work in diplomacy, and my previous job, which was, I don't know if you Northern Californians know, there's a city to the south of here called Los Angeles that I used to run. It's a great place if you've never been. And I was always confused why Northern Californians didn't seem to like Southern California. We love you, so I come here with lots of love and in peace. But whether it's politics or diplomacy, even the nature of what we do is changing in the sense that we live in this kind of one-click instant culture where people say, solve complex problems right now, or if not, I'm upset and I want change, or I demand that you do 100% of what I want. We've lost some of those things that stabilize us. You know, yesterday, after 2 days with all the ambassadors, we broke up into our geographical bureaus in the State Department. For me, I'm part of the South and Central Asia Bureau, so all the stands and then all of South Asia. And I brought a friend in to talk to us over lunch, Tom Friedman, who is the great columnist, 3-time Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times columnist. And he had a wonderful metaphor that I want to share with you, because he said, his wife is a big environmentalist, served on Conservation International Board for many years. And he said once he went to India and saw the mangroves, Sundaram, that were, right there in eastern India that are this incredible web. And we have mangroves in Florida and other parts of the world, but mangroves, which are those kind of forests that grow between the sea and the shore, have this incredible effect in nature. They protect fish because of all of the roots and the way they grow. It's a safe place for fish to spawn. They protect folks from extreme weather, as we just saw in India, where the cyclone that came and devastated so much of Bangladesh had much less of an effect in India, where there's been protection and regrowth of the mangroves. They also prevent erosion. in a moment of climate change to make sure that the coastline stays and so on. And he said, but much of the world, we've seen the mangroves get destroyed. And so much ecological devastation is the consequence. And he took that as a metaphor. He said, as a society, we also for many years have had mangroves, these highly complex systems of things that stabilize our coastline, metaphorically, that we would find compromise in politics, that we'd have newspapers that were widespread, local, and impartial, that we would accept information and debate them and not always expect to have 100% of what we wanted. And he said, like the mangroves that have been destroyed, in many ways, the political mangroves of our past seem to also be eroding and in danger. But he also gave us a hopeful note, which is, he said, mangroves can be rebuilt. In fact, India has done some great work in this. We're seeing other parts of the world figuring out how to do that. And he said, I think politically we can imagine the rebuilding of a world that is like in nature. The only thing that stabilizes the unrest is highly complex organic systems. And when he said that, I thought immediately of the two countries I focus on for all of my days right now, the United States and India. The two largest democracies in the world, probably the two most diverse countries in the world by different measures of diversity, and places in which the complexity itself is the story. There's a great awakening happening in the United States about India. I'm preaching to the converted, those who have been the US-India relationship, or those who are at least a little US-India curious. And yet here, because we know Indians and India have known America and Americans much better than vice versa for many years now. But every CEO that comes through, every political leader when I'm in Washington, D.C., many folks in higher education, and every week there's another chancellor or president coming to town in India, are like, explain India to me. I know I need to know India. And I say, let me tell you two things about India. I use two metaphors. One is that India is like a sandwich, and the more bites you take, the bigger the sandwich becomes. You're never going to consume it. And second, the more you know about India, the more you know you don't know. So be prepared to be more ignorant at the end of the journey than you are at the beginning. But that doesn't mean that you can't have a chapter written for yourself and collectively in this moment about India and the US-India relationship. And the chapter I would offer, if it was a title right now, is really about how the US-India relationship is and needs to be a stabilizing force for good in the world. I believe that in my heart. I believe that since I first went to India when I was 14 years old and was blown away by this country in 1985 that my parents took my sister and I to, that I then returned to when my college roommate, as some of you know, who was randomly assigned to me first year, his father, the second year, I was at a university when I was studying Hindi and Urdu and some of the great religious and cultural and historic texts of India, said, my dad just became the US ambassador to India. Hey, you want to go visit? And I stayed 2 nights in Delhi on my second trip at the US ambassador's home in Delhi, where I thought I was going to live, but then we're doing construction, so I'm never going to live there this round. And I saw for the next decades, every time I went back to India, and my third trip was actually on the dime of the Asia Society. Well, maybe it's my fourth trip. But I was in Asia Society, Asia 21, first class, young fellow, which was bringing together from across the Indo-Pacific young leaders or would-be leaders from all the way from the Middle East to America to discuss the future of the Indo-Pacific, even before we used that term. And we took as one of our gatherings a trip to Kerala, and we went to Kochi and had discussions and looked at the changes that were happening in India at that time. And every time I returned, I was blown away by how different the country was each 5 to 10 years. And when I returned to Delhi, it had been 20 years since I'd been in Delhi. For whatever reason, I'd traveled in the South and other places in my trips just before coming there. It was a brand new capital in so many ways. Gurgaon, the southern part, and the great towers that had come up reminded me of when China in the 90s was starting to build these massive pieces of infrastructure. The roads, the highways, I didn't recognize them as Indian. I'm like, where are the cows and where are the bikes and where are the things to dodge? They're like just regular highways, with an occasional rickshaw on them. And the trains, the airports, 15 airports being built a year, major airports, some of them in as few as 16 months, airports that are as fine as any airports you'll fly in, and now more flights happening in India and the growth of the Indian aviation market, which, by the way, we're doing a U.S.-India Aviation Summit in 2 weeks in Washington, D.C. There's so much change happening that I could see where India was headed. But what I also have seen since I've been there is that the U.S.-India relationship is not a relationship of two countries plus each other. It's not U.S. plus India. What I've witnessed over this last year plus as ambassador is that this is a multiplicative relationship. When U.S. and India work together economically, diplomatically, politically, militarily, when we're looking at social progress, when we're looking at environmental actions to confront climate change, it's a multiplicative relationship. India times the U.S. Whether it's at G20, which was the finest G20, I think, in history, that India hosted last year and our president came to, where we saw India kind of talk to a certain group of countries that maybe the U.S. doesn't have as strong relations with, and the U.S. talk to nations that maybe India doesn't have as strong relations with, but together we landed a unanimous joint statement, really, that India landed mostly, but with U.S. help, to be able to show that even in an era of war, we can come together on women's empowerment, on economic development, on health, on all of the things that are critical to our future, shows that when the U.S. and India track together, we're a pretty unstoppable force. That's at the macro level. At the micro level, I've seen India and the U.S. pioneer what I call geometric diplomacy, where we're not just interested in what we can do for our own countries, but we're truly interested in what we can do for the world. Many countries are often cynical about the U.S. and foreign policy, and maybe we earned that decades past. We did more directly meddle in the affairs of other countries, but I know with nearly 2,500 people who work in the U.S. mission, it's the second biggest mission now in the world, with 5 posts, really 7 posts, including 2 that we're adding as consulates, hopefully this year in Ahmedabad and finally in Bengaluru. Anybody from Bangalore here? All right. We finally, after many, many years, we're going to get Bangalore open. We really do see the ability through these folks to do good in health, to do good when it comes to women's empowerment, to do good when it comes to economic empowerment, and together with India to do that in third countries. US Aid and the Ministry of External Affairs have a program called TRIDEP, the Trilateral Development Partnership, which, for instance, America paid to bring healthcare workers from Fiji, many of them who had cultural links back to India to learn from India and USAID about telemedicine in the most remote parts of Fiji. It was the biggest training of Fijian health workers outside of Fiji in history, in New Delhi. We did that recently with Filipino healthcare workers. Next, it's going to be Tanzania, looking at solar power. And the list is unlimited because the United States and India, I think, do want to see that the so-called global South will have opportunities that is not about debt traps, that is not promoting dictatorship or autocracy, that is about democracy, that is about empowerment, it is about the financing that doesn't keep people in debt for generations, and that offers really, I think, the great strategic fight of our lives, which is between extremism, whether that's religious extremism or whether that's political extremism, and democracy, as imperfect as they are. And I think both countries can criticize themselves. We often sometimes criticize each other. India's a little better about, we always say, please criticize us. India never does. India's like, why are you criticizing? We're like, we can't help ourselves. That's kind of what America does. But we're learning to get to understand each other's hearts and think more into our heads than ever before. I call it the 4 Ps. I've tried to organize all of our work into 4 Ps. Peace, which is our strategic work and our kind of human rights work together. Prosperity, which is our economic work, including, I said, our Critical Emerging Technologies Initiative, which I think can define democracy as something positive rather than negative for our futures. Planet, which are the things that ignore borders like climate and health. And people, which is everything from education to sports. Next week, I'll be seeing the United States play India in cricket in New York. I know it's going to be a very close match. It's going to be By the way, what happened to the Pakistan-US game? US won today? Thank you, India. I'm sure that's one we might have been rooting on together, but wow. Seriously? I gotta go. I gotta make some phone calls. That's crazy. I was watching a little bit and I was like, we have a chance. And I was watching the odds go on the Google odds thing from 80 to 70 to like 65, to wow.
They're tied and then the super over there.
That's amazing. We'll get back to cricket in a second, but that's the fourth P, which is, people and the people-to-people ties, which have been so strong, whether it's visa reforms to speed up and increase the number of visas, work I'm very proud of, or whether it's looking at the educational institutions that are coming together in historic ways. We also have seen just this week, and it's really great timing that you've invited me to be able to speak, we've seen the election happen in India. 640 million people casting their votes. I mean, when asked, and I was at the White House on Monday and speaking yesterday, helped arrange the call of our president to the prime minister. He was in France for D-Day, but made it a priority and was able to speak to Prime Minister Modi, congratulate him and the NDA coalition, but also just to see people do the unexpected. That happens in democracy. That's important about democracy. We certainly have experienced it in our democracy, and we have our own election later this year. But to understand and to see that democracy is not only alive and well in India, but to see the way that voting machines on donkey back up mountain tops, I always said if you're that one monk that that's in Ladakh apparently who gets a voting machine just for him, what would it be like if the official arrived and he said, yeah, this year I don't feel like voting, but thanks for the 5-day journey and send him back, because that's your right too in a democracy. But to see that was, to me, very reassuring, that we can get into the narcissism of small differences. And those small differences sometimes are important. But the fifth P, principles of finding those things that do unite us and the work that we can do together to promote not just technology and economy, not just material things, not just an increased defense partnership, not just the work we can do to protect our planet, but to also make sure that we are a force for good is maybe the defining part of this relationship when we get it right. I've been saying that our heads are more aligned than they've ever been, US and India. I think our hearts, because of a lot of immigration, a lot of human connection, a lot of work over decades, our hearts feel more than they ever have before. The question for the US-India relationship now is, can our feet be as aligned as our heads and our heart? Can we move two very different bureaucracies that act differently? That the work that the Consul General and I do of like, well, why does your system work that way? Because ours works that way. Can we figure out the ways to move forward? And I'm very hopeful that we will. Because when Prime Minister Modi came to the United States for the state dinner, I was told by a lot of veterans of these state dinners, it was my first one, that if you get 5 or 10 deliverables, like actual things beyond the symbolism out of it, that's a strong, strong state visit. I'll tell you, we had 173 deliverables that we were tracking at that time. And we haven't let up on any of them. It was the US and India together who are thinking things through like the IMEC corridor, the India-Middle East corridor, which even in the midst of war in the Middle East could be part of the solution of peace for the Middle East and reestablish the old spice route, not just the Silk route, but the spice route below, and really connect Europe to Southeast Asia and strengthen the relationship between South Asia and the Middle East. When you think about the biofuels alliance that was launched at G20 together, when you look at the way that we did the GE engine deal, which will ensure our defense cooperation, and for those of you who saw my video, I said we did a record number of defense exercises, and then I had all these Marines that were doing jumping jacks. I said, not that kind of military exercise, but they looked pretty good doing that. But real exercises where we're understanding how to integrate and deter bad actors, and hopefully never have to fight together because we want peace, not war, but to know how to at least wage war together if called on that. This is historic in a way that I think an observer of US-India relationship never would have imagined 10 years ago, let alone 30 or 40. So I really want to hear more your questions and answers. I didn't read any, I'm staffing myself today, so don't tell my team I read nothing on this great speech that they wrote me. I'll use it another time. But we used to say sky's the limit of the US-India relationship. But I just came back from Bangalore, which was my when I visited Karnataka, my 23rd state of or territory of 36 just in 1 year. It's been an amazing journey from the Himalayas to Kanyakumari, from Nagaland all the way to the Wagah border, and which is a great show, by the way, the Wagah border show. Although I have to practice my goose step kicks. They're pretty impressive at that age. But in Bangalore, I met with the chairman of ISRO. And what a year this was for India. Congratulations, Mr. Consul General, again, landing, whatever, a tenth, a hundredth the price of what we do, a module on the dark side of the moon, the first country to do so. And to really see and understand that, and soon later this year, we'll launch NISAR, which is NASA and ISRO's joint satellite that will look at the Earth's data. It's like going to a checkup. We look at the vital statistics of ourselves with our blood pressure and our temperature, everything, and our weight and our height. This will do that for the Earth, looking at what's happening with our air, our oceans, our seas, our ice cap, to understand the health of Earth and climate change. That's US and India together. There'll be an Indian astronaut on an American mission this year too. So maybe we should reframe that it's no longer the sky's the limit, because we're going beyond the sky to the stars. As a mayor, I can't help but thank our fire department. Good job, guys, always. But it's no longer the sky's the limit. It's from the seabed to the stars. And it's not just the physical space we move in. I believe it'll be the value space that will define us. And if we can hang on to remembering who we are as great democracies, who we are as diverse populations, and don't get me wrong, democracies are harder than dictatorships. Diverse populations are harder than monochromatic ones. But would we rather in India or the United States live in any other place than those sorts of societies? Of course not. So let us embrace those challenges. Let us work through those differences. Let us recognize the depth of our friendship. Let us take those 4 Ps and the 5th one of peace and prosperity of our planet and our people, and find those principles that will redefine this as the greatest chapter, not just in US-India history, but a contribution to what will be a much more hopeful chapter for our Earth. God knows we need it. Thank you so much. And with that, what's on your mind? Yeah, back there.
I think the video you did proved that you're from LA and India, both. Who came up with the script and who thought of it? It's really one of the best informative and entertaining videos I've ever seen.
I always try to answer all questions honestly. It probably got me in trouble as mayor a couple times, and sometimes even as ambassador. But the truthful answer is I had a really good script that my team gave me, but it wasn't very funny, and I come from Hollywood, so I rewrote it, and I said, do you think we could try to do this? I don't know if any of you know the Dollar Shave Club. It's my friend who started that, Mike, had a great video that made that company, besides the actual product, where he just kind of did this wacky, hilarious video. And I said, I know Indian humor is a little different than American humor, but I got this idea, and if we do a little Hindi in there and some other stuff, let's try. And the ultimate test was going to be, before we hit send, I'll show it to my 12-year-old daughter, Maya, and if she says, Dad, that's really cringy, I wouldn't send it. But if she said it wasn't too cringy, in her words, we'd send it. So we rewrote it. I have a great team. We just thought of, like, instead of saying the stats of what we did, let's show it. We got cricket into the Olympics here in America in 2028, and we announced it in India and worked with India on it. And saw cricket diplomacy. In Bengaluru, I got to play blind cricket with a group of blind athletes who are incredible, that blew me away. We looked at the trade, which I think when we get the final numbers, some folks said we're 0.101 million less than China. I think we'll be number 1 again. Certainly if you look at services, number 1 trading partner in a record amount. Brought down 7 different tariffs from the old, tariff war that we had a few years back. The military work that we did, not just with the engines, the MQ-9 drones, hopefully a couple more to announce soon. We went straight through all of these things as proof points, but what made the video was the crying baby. So my advice to you is, if you ever want a good video, we didn't know he was going to cry. It was the baby of the woman who does all my social media. She's like, just hold my baby when you're talking about space. And the baby, of course, when you hand a baby like this to a stranger, it starts to cry. And we just kind of improv that line of, sure, he's crying now, but he'll be happy when we send him up into space. I don't even know. Not sure what that line even means, but it resonated. And we got 580 million views of that, which I guess is a moderate success in India. I don't know. I'll go there and I'll come back to you.
There's lots going on between India and the US.
Yes.
And you've talked about a few of those. But what's the one thing that when you bring back to the US, everybody here is surprised or astounded to hear? I mean, there's a lot of the numbers, the population, the 680 million who just voted.
Right.
But what's the one thing that you think Americans should really start paying attention to?
I mean, everybody loves those stats, right? 15 and younger, or aged 15 and younger, Indians are as big as the population of our country. Everybody always loves, hearing about UP's population and size, third the size of Texas, 250 million people. But I think the thing that really surprises people that I bring up that a lot of people don't talk about, in 2 weeks we'll have, just before the aviation summit, we call it Select USA. Some of you may have been to it. It's the key investment summit we do for every country of the world to invest in the United States. And last year, when I went to it, just after I became ambassador, India, for the first time we recruited, had more delegates coming to invest in the United States than any country in the world for the first time. This year we'll repeat that. But the bigger statistic is that Indian deals that came out of that, more dollars are being invested from India in the US than from any other country in that Select USA project. So $3.4 billion of investment. And why I love that is I think for a lot of Americans, they say, oh, India's like up and coming, there's exciting things happening, the hype is real, going to be, third largest economy soon. By the way, California's economy and India's economy are about the same size. We used to always brag, that if we were an independent country, it'd be fifth largest economy. Now India is, so it's kind of a nice synchronicity there for now. But I don't think that Americans think of it as a two-way street. They think about American companies going into India. They think about India as this poor country, and it certainly still is a developing country, but the middle class is roaring out of it. They don't think of it as technologically advanced except for like maybe back shop, outsourcing, when there's more people connected at a cheaper price to data than anywhere in the world, and Chaiwala within a day can set up her business and use UPI to take payments in a rural village. Those things I think surprise people, that this is now something that is benefiting the United States. Like take nuclear energy. We just did a thing on civil nuclear deal, which really opened up our relations a little under 20 years ago. And there's still an outstanding issue of liability for American nuclear companies that want to invest in India that I hope we can address and that the president's talked to the prime minister about. But it's not just liability for American companies in India. You might see Indian energy companies, nuclear companies, we'll certainly see battery companies and others from India investing in the United States. To me, that is so exciting that we could be able to narrate that Indian investment are saving American jobs. Like, right? I mean, we have steel mills in Ohio that were going to be shut down, mines in Minnesota that weren't working, and it's Indian capital actually making that happen. And I think if I had one ambition for this year, it would be for India and the United States to break down as many barriers as quickly as possible to make it a frictionless trade relation, especially in the area of technology. The iPhones, sorry, this is a Samsung, my official iPhone's in the car. But iPhones now, which are being manufactured in India, 70,000, mostly women in South India at a factory that Apple loves. Proof point that when you do relax the rules or bring down the barriers in India, you will build the ecosystem and capital will flow. But it's not going quickly enough, in my opinion, to meet the needs of India's ambitions. And similarly, we have barriers sometimes to doing the same. If we could break those barriers down, maybe one day there'll be free trade agreement, but I'm not calling it that. Preferential trade understandings between us on some key areas. I had somebody who opened that factory in South India say the $200 billion of trade today could be by the end of the decade, $400 billion, based on Silicon Valley and a few other companies outside of Silicon Valley, vertical companies that make electronics in the United States, are horizontal companies that make the components, saying India is the shop floor of choice. It isn't yet today, but I think we can make it that tomorrow. I think you had an extra rule now. Go ahead, Rahul.
First of all, Ambassador, thank you very much for your speech. I'm very glad
So-
that of the two great powers of the world today, it's my country that doesn't engage in wolf warrior diplomacy. So I'm very happy to see that. Second of all, it does touch a little bit to what you were speaking about at the very end, but there's a lot of discussion with U.S.-India relations on software and AI and science,
Yep.
but the hardware, the industrial manufacturing is less brought up.
Yep.
So what do you think should be done to bring about greater synergy in manufacturing specifically between the two countries?
So the work that America has to do is to trust India more and to understand how good India is as a place to manufacture. Certainly with semiconductors, there's fewer better places in the world in terms of incentives, though I think India needs to still build and acknowledges the skills in the workforce and some of the more complex manufacturing. But start at a lower level on semiconductors, and that will build up. And we've helped bring some very historic investments. Mukesh has helped that as well, and others. But first, Americans need to look at India as a place of choice. India, on the flip side, needs to not tax inputs as much, because I understand it. Make in India is a great goal, one that we should support too. It's in line with our diversifying of our shop floors for manufacturing around the world. But right now, when I talk to Indian businesses themselves, they say, oh, we get taxed for things we can't make today. We will be able to make tomorrow. But we need 3, 5, and on some very complex things, maybe as much as 10 years of not having components taxed, because then we're not competitive by the time we add those components to the rest that we can do and try to ship that out. When I was mayor of LA, we had the busiest port in the Western Hemisphere in the port of Los Angeles. A lot of the components that came in from Asia on ships helped us have manufacturing in the United States. If we put a 50% tax on those, we wouldn't have manufacturing in the United States. There's very little that we can do 100% of right here. And so understanding that, instead of being kind of building up walls and saying, if we build a wall, force people to come in and 100% of it. I had a very good shoe company, for instance, that came to me, American shoe company, and the Indian government, I think, will be helpful to them. But initially was saying, look, we want to make very complex running shoes here. Some of the components you can't make in India, and it'll take it 2 or 3 years at least before we can. But we're thinking we'll just go to Vietnam, because right now they don't tax that if we bring that in from someplace else. India does, so we'll just keep making the cheap ones here in India, and India will lose that chance and we'll never have that factory here. So it's just sharing those stories, I think, with a government that's done an amazing job to really, I mean, if you look at India today versus 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago, the speed and the ease of doing business are amazing. The last thing is, and I know that CII, the main kind of business organization in India, is talking to the government about this, is bring together all the states in one place. So the decision makers in states, because they have a federal system like us, can try to standardize so it's less unpredictable state to state. States will always compete. We do that here. Texas is the best place. California is the best place. Come to New York. But if you can standardize this, I think American companies are more likely to invest more by knowing, well, in one state it might be good, but another one, the rules can change in 2 years, or a tax is added to that, or a rule has changed. And certainly there's been those experiences in the past. I don't think that's the India so much today, but that would help, I think, build that confidence. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, Rahul. Oh, he's up. He's down. He's up.
You've been observing India closely for 40 years. Is there one initiative of the US that's actually been transformative for even a country like India? I have a candidate, since we are in Silicon Valley, which predates you.
What is it?
No, it's the KIA, the Kanpur Indo-American Project, which is the largest US education, which actually modernized computer science, introduced computer science and modernized engineering education. Today, even here, everybody can trace back to learning computer programming from Rajaraman's books, which are all notes and books. Is there something like this which you can do now? Dare to be great, Ambassador Garcetti.
Absolutely. I tell my staff to raise their ambition all the time, because I don't want us doing small ball. I don't think we'll look back at resolving the small things, even though Consul General and I probably spend most of our time on parking spaces, and we're trying to help the Indian Embassy in DC get 3 more parking spaces. As a former mayor, I know that Indian diplomats don't vote, but everybody in the neighborhood does. So I think we're making progress, and then we beg for like our school's lease getting renewed. But we're not going to look back on those things and say those are the big accomplishments. We're going to look at those things. I think that's a great candidate. Obviously, the Green Revolution I would put as like the biggest. India fed itself, is one of the greatest food exporters in the world based on what we did together. And India very proudly, when it was much poorer, said we're not an aid recipient. We want assistance, and paid us for that. Then we used all of that. Besides buying a few homes, including the one that I'm living in, we mostly gave that back to India in a historic thing that started the IITs, helped the Green Revolution happen, and historic grants. So I put that in contention. Space, the first rockets that were launched were American rockets in 1963 out of Kerala in India that really helped launch the Indian space movement and space industry. I mean, I can go 4 or 5 different, we had a rocky 20, 25 years in there, but even in the midst of that, some of the things we did, the Fulbright scholars on both sides, that how can you quantify that? Because so many of them have done so many things, not just for their own countries, but between US and India. So it's really difficult to find one. Even the broadcasting from space of children's programming to remote villages in India, yeah. Like how do you quantify what impact that had on children and the dreams that were planted? Maybe many of them came as immigrants to the United States after that experience. So the big things, besides the manufacturing thing that I just mentioned, to me, ISET, this initiative on critical emerging technologies, does have the power to change our relationship in the world. We don't have much going on with quantum right now. I want to see us do something more there. And I think that's going to be based on American quantum technology being given to India to use. I think India right now, one of the big things that they're doing, and arguably further ahead than us, is our work together on 5G and soon 6G technology that is not linked to Huawei or China. India did that before us. India could be a great manufacturing and exporting center of that and show how to do open RAN systems, which I think are not about control, monitoring. They're not about harming us. They're not about hurting us. They're about technology that connects us and protects us. I think is a big swing kind of thing to do and to try to export to the world. DPI, the digital public infrastructure stack, that if I've helped move our government from cynical to skeptical to neutral to like, hey, this is a pretty good idea. Now I want us to move into being partners, because I think just as we're doing with Fiji and healthcare workers, imagine taking that to the Pacific Island countries where there's a real competition for them. But if we can put it on our servers with Indian kind of software customized for small countries that could never do this on their own, they can have health, they can have their own ID, they can have payment systems. That's a pretty big swing. And then the last thing I would say is I really want to see the United States and India do more on artificial intelligence or augmented intelligence. We have that as part of ISET, but I think we can go much further on defining the standards. And I hope both of our countries will resist the temptation to go it alone. Tom Friedman was kind of sketching out this idea, don't quote me on it, that there's kind of three great centers of the world emerging and that exist. Europe, United States, and India as the three kind of great democratic clusters of the world. And that those three legs of a stool can stabilize a very unstable world, and then can apply those values to the technological changes that are happening and the challenge of our lives, which is climate change. So technology, climate, democracy together, even when we have some differences, I think can be the defining big swing of our life. Thanks for the question. Any other questions? Over here, sorry. Yeah.
Ambassador,
Absolutely. Good to see
you have the unique distinction of being a mayor of a major American city
Yep.
and now being an ambassador to a country that's very rapidly urbanizing.
Yes.
So I'm curious from your perspective, what are the things that American cities can learn from Indian cities, and what are the things that Indian cities can
Yeah.
learn from major American cities?
It's a great, great question. And I'm very excited to announce that later this year, with the blessing of the Ministry of External Affairs, we'll be, or early next year, but it's probably the end of this year, we'll be having the first US-India cities exchange in India. The State Department is late to the game compared to other countries about having now a initiative on sub-national diplomacy. I was always amazed as mayor when I go around the world, go to Seoul City Hall, there's like 100 people working on international relations. Here, most cities don't even have a deputy mayor. In fact, my deputy mayor who's running this program now, former ambassador Nina Hachigian, she was the first deputy mayor for international affairs of any city in America when I was mayor. Yet we're so international, but we just don't program that. On the flip side, India has a very different structure of cities. It's a very unique country in the world of not having city leaders that are kind of elected with executive power over most of the departments and functions of a city. That's usually run by the state. I was recently in AP in Vizag, and it's one of the 3 smart cities that President Obama launched with the Prime Minister to look at smart cities back in, I think, 2014, if I'm not mistaken. And I went to their control center for the city, because we had one in LA. And I learned a lot of things from them. Like, we were one of the first cities in the world in LA to have like a control center with dashboards, and you could look at real time for pothole filling, if there's an emergency, manage it. But this one had leapfrogged us in all sorts of different things. While at the same time I said, oh, so you have that problem with traffic or sanitation, so you're in control of that? They're like, no, we only have 2 departments of like the 50 that are actually under our control. So I've heard a lot of Indians talk about maybe the next iteration is going to be laws that would empower, although it's tough to give up power. So do state leaders ever want to give up power? Does anybody ever want to give up power? But whether or not they can empower more cities besides the big ones, which have usually municipal corporations, to have kind of more independent decision-making power, and vice versa. Can we apply some of the technology that India is using? I think India, we can learn a lot from the way they empower local grassroots public health, economic empowerment. India does a better job of getting benefits to people's front doors. Like, interesting in the kind of human rights space, India, I think, is further advanced than this country in most categories on transgender rights. And the current chair of the Human Rights Commission, Bharat Lal, who's a good friend, is working on, they did a census and asked people to fill out whether they're trans, and millions of people said they are, but it's probably a fraction of what they are. So he's like, we need to get all the rest to openly say that they are. And there's a card that gives 16 benefits to the trans community who are, like here, often locked into sex work, into poverty, into bad health, and gets them benefits. And they're walking it to their doors, not just saying this exists, come to a government center like we do. So I've been very impressed, whether it's that or other things, the way government actually can touch in a 1.4 billion person nation people's lives directly. And then the last thing I'll say, back on something I hope we can share with India, is pollution and air quality. I think one of the defining things, certainly my time in Delhi, 13 of the 15 worst cities of pollution, with air pollution, are now in India. I think the other 2 are, one's in Pakistan, one's in Bangladesh. I mean, it's a regional problem, but just as Los Angeles, when I grew up, I don't come to preach and teach, I grew up with the worst air in America. Studies showed that my generation in Los Angeles has 85% the lung capacity that we should because of the pollution we had. I would have been a star athlete if it wasn't for that smog. But I think that Indians are increasingly saying, how do we get our heads around this? Because it's not a one-source thing. Everybody always like, oh, it's just the fields that are burning. Oh, it's just the wood. Oh, it's the Diwali and all the weddings and the firecrackers. Oh, it's all the cars. It's actually all those. It's like 15 to 20%. And like we learned in Los Angeles, if you don't have an authority that can actually tell everybody what they have to stop doing, air quality will continue. And I think the estimate in Delhi, for instance, is 10 years less of your life because of the air quality. So maybe that's something we can share with them. But the 3 themes of our city confab will be climate action, city planning, and women's empowerment. So, yes, sir. I'll come back over it. I'll swing back. I know we're short on time, so I'll try to give short answers too. Go ahead.
I'll try to be brief. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I did want to compliment you.
Thank you.
Jonathan hosted a podcast on the ITA website about doing business. I work for an American multinational into assisted surgery. I'm very curious. Common advice.
Can I give you advice? Those wireless mics work when they can't connect, or don't work when they can't connect. So yeah, come closer, or like hold it just gently with 2 fingers or something, and it should connect.
Yeah, no problem.
There you go.
So I work for an American multinational intuitive that focuses on robotic assisted surgery. We have
Nice.
headquarters in Bangalore, and I'm very curious. when multinationals approach your team, what's the most common advice you give them when they are seeking to invest and be successful in India and partnering with their healthcare sector?
Yeah. So my advice always is get a local partner. It's still a nation that you will thrive from having a local partner rather than trying to figure out quickly on your own. It's not a country you're going to figure out in a year or two. I see a lot of the companies that withdraw are ones that go in alone, say, we'll just figure this out ourselves, don't hire the right person locally or don't have the right partner locally. The healthcare space is exploding in India. There's a lot of technology in that too, and there's a lot of big Indian companies and a lot of startups that I think both have advantages. And then I'd say pick your location well. I mean, Bangalore is a great place, obviously, infrastructure is there, but pick your location well because it is still uneven across different states. So get in touch with Jonathan and his team. We're there to assist you. My salary gets paid by the State Department, but I've never worked in the State Department for this job. So I really do take seriously the statute that I'm the President's envoy. So I'm a Commerce Department ambassador as much as I'm a Defense Department ambassador, as much as I'm a State Department ambassador. And the Commerce Department does an amazing job through our Foreign Commercial Service. So they can give you a little bit more detail, but I hope those are a couple good starting tips. Good luck, Dave. Thank you. Yes, Andy. Michelle's going to come down hard on us soon. I got wrap it up there.
I'll keep it very brief.
Okay.
First of all, in a world of doom and gloom,
Uh-huh.
for bringing such realistic sunshine, thank you,
You're welcome.
especially between the two democracies. My question is, granted it only takes few good men and women to change the world, but it's the institutions and the systems that have to change in order to get it implemented.
That's right.
How do we ensure that the old guard in both US and India does not see this like a zero-sum game? That if you do this in India or you do this for India, then the America suffers. Because oftentimes when I'm talking about opportunities, they say, no, but what about the American companies' opportunities in India being compromised,
Right.
and vice versa? Would appreciate your feedback. Thank you.
Do you want to just say what the two other questions are, and I'll answer them together? I think there's one final one over there after that. Go ahead.
So, being in India, you might have realized that apart from traditional medicine, we also have Ayurveda, we also have homeopathy, and that makes us a whole integrative medicine system.
Yeah.
So, what do you see the scope of integrative medicine system in the United States? Because traditional medicine, by default, will always have side effects. So, for minor things, I think Ayurveda or homeopathy work much better, and for major things like a surgery, then traditional medicine works much better. So, what are your thoughts on including integrative medicine between India and United States?
Great. Thank you. There's one other last one back here.
Everyone's thoughts. You're an amazing speaker and you have a way
kind
of
of
moving
you.
the crowd, so thank you, Ambassador. I guess my final question, probably biased interests, but I'm curious to hear what all is happening in terms of US-India alliance on climate change.
Yeah.
I know you referred to biofuels exchange, but I'm curious to hear what are some of the opportunities around there.
Definitely.
Thank you so much.
All right. Climate, health, old guard. Let me see if I can answer it in negative 2 minutes. So on climate change, I'll go backwards. There's so much, and I'm glad the script has changed from on both sides. Like a couple years ago, there's a little bit of the script of like the West saying, speed it up, India and other countries, your ambition isn't early enough, it isn't high enough, it isn't enough. And India and other countries responding, you cause a problem, pay us more. And like you don't hear either country saying that, either side saying that anymore, which is good. And the reason why is because India has, I think, blown its own goals out of the water on renewables. There's still some legitimate conversations around, given how much more power India needs, the renewables can go up to where they are now, 40%. Only about 20% actually distributed, but that's a solvable problem, but 40% capacity, and soon will be probably 50% ahead of schedule. But there will be an addition of, the projections are without nuclear, without storage, and I'm a little bit more bullish on storage than, nuclear is going to be important, but it can't solve everything. You will add as much coal as eliminating the fourth biggest coal country, Germany, from coal completely on top of that. And that won't be good for pollution, that won't be good for emissions, et cetera. So we have to kind of figure out that together. But mostly the conversation has now changed to how do we work together on the supply chain, critical minerals, photovoltaic cells that aren't manufactured in China. How do we finance? So Development Finance Corporation, which is kind of our big finance arm now of the US government, number one country is India. 10% of our whole book of business in the world is there. Next biggest country is 2.5%. So India is overwhelmingly our favorite place. In Tamil Nadu, we opened up first solar, an American company's manufacturing plant, a $500 million plant that uses non-polysilicon to have cells that can get critical minerals that aren't throttled in China. And then you see companies like Adani that are doing, the largest energy project in human history in the Gujarat desert, and soon being able to manufacture photovoltaics without any components from China in them, converting solar into green electrons, converting that to fuels that can come out of the port. I mean, you want to see the future, go there and fly over that solar field, go to the port and understand what's coming together. It's the only thing that's analogous to the Inflation Reduction Act. We're financing electric vehicles, 10,000 electric buses, where we're guaranteeing the financing to help bus companies throughout India get to zero emissions. And one thing I'd like to add that is not yet as robust, but it's a goal of mine, is figuring out a way to get buildings, green buildings, into the conversation. Because the best thing to do is not to build a new power plant, even the greenest, but is to reduce consumption. And along with the buildings, one of the things we're doing is the most energy efficient air conditioners in the world, which India won the competition for. How do we ramp that up and manufacture them? And this is me coming from Delhi, where it was 129 degrees last Thursday. I'll end that on that note. FDA, Ayurvedic, G20. So this is an issue not just for the United States with Ayurvedic medicine, but I think within India. If you read the headlines recently, what's his name? Patanjali. It happens in our country too, so it's not just unique to India. But a lot of people make a lot of claims, sell people a lot of things. And I think for this truly to become more mainstream, we're going to have to figure out ways to do clinical trials. And I do believe, my sister was trained in acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine. These things absolutely do work, not just for lesser things, sometimes for bigger things when more traditional Western medicine doesn't work. But I do think we have to get rigorous about standards on both sides of the Indo-Pacific. And if the US and India did this in this space, we need to be doing it on medicine. We need to be doing it on a lot of areas so that we can trust Indian standards and not have to repeat them when things come here, and vice versa. Oftentimes, we're doing on both sides. And so if you're doing business, you have to pass the Indian test and then the American test, even though it's the same. If we get that done, I think we can be honest with people about what does work and also accelerate that much more. And I'm all for that, something that we do work on. And the last question on kind of the old guard. There are still some, I don't want to say dying because I don't mean that in the literal sense because they're old, but some dying opinions among the old guard of like, can we really trust America? We have better friends other places in the world. But it really is such a small minority. I mean, we're well past do we trust each other. We really like each other. At a diplomatic level, political level, we've worked for decades with each other. The people in power now, Minister Jaishankar was here as ambassador. We've got people like Kurt Campbell and Rich Verma, who are number 2 in the 2 deputy secretaries. One who was an ambassador in India, the other who authored the Indo-Pacific strategy. I mean, how lucky are we as Indo-American focused to have them leading it? Jake Sullivan, the same thing. I don't think that that's as much a problem at the leader level. Where it does bubble down, and I don't think it's philosophical, is the bureaucratic level, where we still have people in the State Department who say, okay, you want us to make that exception for an Indian company or export controls, but the letter of the law says this. And trying to get people to get to yes instead of no, because it's so easy to get to no. There's 1,000 ways to kill something. There's only one way to get it through. I think they are finally getting the trickle down of their leaders saying, just do it and figure out a way. Don't break any rules. Tell us if we need to rewrite the rules. But more often than not now, I think the bureaucracy is getting the message. And similarly in India, the same thing. Even when we have like little micro conflicts or challenges that we're addressing, the Indian bureaucracy, when we don't talk to them for a few weeks, is like, hey, what's happening with that thing? We need to move that. And that's not always been the Indian way. I think we're always impatient. Indians are kind of sometimes very patient, and we've driven each other crazy in the past. Like, Indians are like, why do Americans want everything right now for retail prices and get out of there? When I always say, we grow up, we go to the store, this is $10, we want to pay for it and leave. In an Indian store, I say, it might be $10, it might be 10 rupees, it might be 1,000 rupees. Sit down, have some tea, let's talk, tell me about your family. If you're not willing to leave the store, you're not serious about this. And so, understanding how we negotiate and how we talk, for Indians I sense a real sense from Indians of urgency in the Indian way of doing business, and I see a real sense of American patience in the way that we always speed things up. So I think it's coming together. And the last thing I'll say, because nobody asked this question, but the most obvious question everybody always asks is, well, what happens if the Indian election goes this way or the American election goes that way? It doesn't depend on who's in power anymore. It is led by, and we've had a very good friend and ally and very pro-American leader in Prime Minister Modi and his government. We've had the most pro-India president in American history, who, as I've shared publicly, said that India is the most consequential relationship we have in the world, something no American president has ever said before Joe Biden. But if tomorrow they weren't our leaders, and I can't say anything political about our election, but obviously he's a friend and I like our president, and we've had the elections in India, but if they weren't there tomorrow, the rest of us would continue and pick up this work. It goes from the grassroots all the way up. And if we can do one thing, it's to bring more Americans to India to understand India. So all of you who have students, all of you are connected to academic institutions, let's figure out a way to bring a new generation of Americans to India so that it isn't just Indians who know America, but Americans who really understand, know, and take a piece of India back. That's the strength of this relationship. America can't change India, nor should it. Indians will change India. And India can't change America. Americans have to change America. But if we have Indians and Americans who understand each other, we can change the world together. And that's something worth building. Thank you all so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. We're definitely hoping that the feet are aligned with the heart and the head. And thank you very much for joining us up here in Northern California.